Well, good morning or good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Justin Hill here in the World Bank in Washington, and welcome to this next webinar on innovation and entrepreneurship policy presented to you through the Innovation Policy Platform and our colleagues in LLI, the Learning and Development Institute here in the World Bank. This week or this month, we're going to concentrate on entrepreneurship because this week is Global Entrepreneurship Week, and we've been holding a series of events. And I'm delighted to welcome our speaker today, Sarasvathy, who is going to be digging into the guts of entrepreneurship and what it actually means, what policies potentially can be used, what types of entrepreneurs she believes should be supported, and that age-old question that can entrepreneurs be born, or are they just born, or can you actually make them? Sarah has a fantastic background to talk about this. She is Associate Professor of Entrepreneurship at the University of Virginia, which is a beautiful campus a couple of hours south of Washington. But importantly for our audience, working out there in the developing world, she also has close links both to India, where she holds a chair of entrepreneurship at the Institute of Management in Bangalore, and also in China, where she holds a professorship in the Nankai University. So this will be a normal webinar. Sarah will probably speak for about 30 minutes. Then we'll have an opportunity for you to pitch questions, which I will then provide to Sarah, and she can respond. We already have a bunch of really interesting questions, so even if we don't get any more, I think we'll have a fascinating discussion. But instead of listening to me, I'll hand over to Sarah and thank her for being involved in this webinar. And over to you, Sarah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Justin, for the introduction. This is Saras here, and I just wanted to wish everyone a happy Entrepreneurship Week, and it's wonderful to see so many of you logging in from so many different countries. So welcome, everyone. I've been told I have about half an hour to go over about 20 years of research, and also to tell you a little bit about what I think we can be thinking about in terms of policy. So let's just get into it. I'm going to keep going as quickly as I can, because I'd like to get to the Q&A part even faster if possible. So I do not know whether there are people here who already know the research program that I've been involved in for about 20 years, which has grown now to become like the basis for entrepreneurship education in many programs around the world. There are literally hundreds of people on this. So if I use the pronoun I want to acknowledge that there are at least 40 other people whose work has gone into a lot of the stuff that I say. So I want to acknowledge that before we get started. So here goes. There is a conventional story out there on how entrepreneurship happens, right? And like a lot of conventional wisdom, it's not exactly right. But let's just start there, right? So when you think about people who have built very successful companies or enduring companies, or however you want to define great entrepreneurship, the story goes like this. The way the company was built, people will tell you, the media tells you, is, the entrepreneur comes up with a brilliant idea, then, they show there's a large market for it. They go out and write a winning business plan that convinces everybody. So they raise some money, put together a team, they build and grow the venture. Then, they go public or sell, and of course, go off to the Bahamas, right? And this is actually not how great entrepreneurship happens. And that's what we have seen over and over again over the last, about 20 years of research. So when you look at this question of how do people actually build great ventures, one of the things we have done in the research is not to simply look at successful entrepreneurship, but to look at expert entrepreneurship. Expert entrepreneurship suggests that you have been through every possible experience that entrepreneurship has to offer, including successes and failures. So here's the definition of an expert entrepreneur. at least 15 years experience founding and running companies, multiple ventures, including successes and failures, and at least one IPO. So when you take this definition, you can see that these are people who have been through every single experience that entrepreneurship can offer. And then when we go and look at what are some of the things that they have learned the hard way and that they regularly use in their decision making and action on a daily basis, we get this thing that we call effectuation. As I said, I'm not going to have time to go into the details of this research, but that's available in other sources that I'll point to in a minute. But I will give you a very quick summary first. Then I'll summarize what I think may be interesting policy implications, and then dive deeper into effectuation just a little bit, maybe a couple of minutes, and then come back to the policy implications. So it's kind of an iterative way that I have organized the slides here. So here goes. What is the key finding from the research? The most important thing that came out of the research originally was this idea that the standard models of management and entrepreneurship are all based on this logic, which is actually a good logic, that to the extent that we can predict the future, we can control it. But the expert entrepreneurs kind of inverted that logic, and they actually have figured out a way to make decisions without predicting the future. So their logic that they learned the hard way through experience, but now that we know it, we can also teach it. Is really this idea that to the extent that we can control the future, we don't need to predict it. Sounds pretty cool until you ask, how the heck do you control a future you cannot predict? It turns out, and as I said before I kind of tell you what that is, I just wanted to take a very quick look at the research that we already have. And there's much more that is not on this slide, which is basically a whole bunch of replications of the original expert entrepreneurship study. We have looked at corporate managers who have, expert corporate managers who have no entrepreneurial experience. We have looked at novice entrepreneurs. We have looked at angel investors, venture capitalists on different levels of experience, organic growth leaders in large firms. And we've also written about 200 case histories so far. So just to give you a very quick picture of the amount of research that's gone into spelling this out. Now back to the idea of controlling, basically working with things within your control in the face of an unpredictable future. So the simple way to think about effectuation is that you work with what's already within your control. And what you do with that is to co-create the future without having to predict it. So let's take a look at this for a moment and think about this. What does it mean, right? So the key here is not that you're achieving control over the future. What you really are doing is working with things that you already have within your control in the present. And that then allows you to co-create with people who want to co-create with you. They're all self-selected stakeholders. And you end up creating something that actually gives you control in the outcome as well. So this is the simplest way I can explain it, but as it is already kind of complex. But I'm going to keep pressing forward here in the interest of time. So based on the research, when I was approached by the World Bank to do this webinar, I started thinking, what would be some things that as policymakers, we can start thinking about. And I am definitely not a policymaker. I'm not even an expert on policy in any way, but I just kind of put myself in the shoes and remembered conversations with policymakers over the years. And here are some things that I came up with that we can discuss today. The most important, even if we don't discuss anything else, I would like us to discuss this one, is really the idea that we should not be teaching entrepreneurship only to potential entrepreneurs, that we should be teaching it to everybody. So I hope we'll get to discuss this in some depth. The other thing which is connected is this idea that the reason you want to be teaching it to everyone is because I think entrepreneurship is as big a force for positive social change as science itself, right? So we don't teach science only to potential scientists. We teach it to everybody for a good reason. And as a result of that, as a result of some things that happen in history, we have been able to build out the middle class of the labor market, right? The middle class, that people are not just poor or rich, that you can actually work your way from poor to rich. And a similar thing has to be thought of in terms of businesses as well. And a couple of other things that I thought in terms of policy was we do not understand exit, right? There is a lot of myths out there about failure and success, but I think there is a lot of data that we can collect that we don't have yet that could be useful in building the curriculum in entrepreneurship that we need to teach to everybody. The other thing, of course, I think some of you might already know about this, people who are involved in Endeavor Global, for example, that mentors make a big difference. And so the idea of beginning to build some kind of a network of mentors would be useful. And the last one is kind of a profound one. I think overall, we need to rethink the relationship between education, employment in the normal sense of the word, and entrepreneurship. All right, to keep going, let me dive a little deeper into why we need to teach entrepreneurship to everyone, and then I'll go back into the research on effectuation that shows what we need to be teaching. So I mentioned this already about the analogy between the scientific method and the entrepreneurial method, but think about this for a second. Why do we teach science to everybody? Why don't we just find out people who are going to be potential scientists or who say, I want to be scientists, and then teach them? It's because we actually want to develop a complete ecosystem, a society, a citizenry capable of thinking scientifically. Even if you don't think scientifically all the time in your life, the idea of reasoning in a scientific way that is not just depending on, divine revelation or just individual instinct in some way, to actually say that there is a way you and I can talk together, think about the universe, find answers for questions, find the answers for questions that we would like to answer, but we don't have answers to. A lot of those ideas connected with what it means to be scientific is something we need to teach everybody if we want to benefit from science, not only to scientists. And I think a similar thing we need to do with entrepreneurship. And there are a lot of people, as I said, there are about 400 educators. They are beginning to work with, the group of researchers that I work with are not the only ones trying to build out what this curriculum should look like. There are people around the world, people using the ideas, the logic, and the theory, but actually getting practical information from their local environment who are building the education materials. And not only that, the interesting thing that has happened, something that I myself did not anticipate, people are beginning to teach this outside of business, in engineering, in music, people are developing ideas connected with entrepreneurial negotiation of peace, and of course in the K through 12 system. And many of this information is on a website that I can point you to later, so I'm going to keep pressing on here. So I hope I've given at least, give you pause to think about, yeah, maybe we need to be teaching it to everybody. But now let's think about some of the immediate ways from an economic development perspective, why we need to teach this to everybody, but also why we need to not think only in terms of startups or Gazelles or billion-dollar companies. We need to be really thinking about the entire space of business, and even outside of business, thinking about social ventures, nonprofit organizations, the entire landscape of organizations. And let's think about why we need to do that, how we need to do that, and how effectuation can help. So here is kind of a picture of history, right? So you can think about it, you can trace back the scientific method all the way to Al-Hamdi in Arabia, but most of us use, Francis Bacon's Novum Organum as the starting point in some ways, because it led to the institutionalization of science. being taught to everybody, things like that. And you can see that one of the results, there are many, many things you can connect to the scientific method. One of the results is the rise of the middle class. Now think about this population of businesses, if you will. What happens here if you look at this picture and you look at the number of ventures in the economy on the vertical axis and venture size over time, this shape is pretty typical of most firm landscapes in the world. At this point in time, most people will start really tiny 1-person, 2-person companies, startups, that is at the top left-hand corner. Very, very few firms will actually grow into gigantic companies that employ a lot of people. But if you really want to think about increasing jobs and economic development, we want to think about these businesses in the middle. I don't think there is much of a controversy in that. The question really is, how do we do that? And so I wanted to think about this for a minute, hone into the picture a little bit more and kind of connect it with the research that we have been doing. So from the research on expert entrepreneurs, we actually discovered 5 different principles through which you can actually co-create the future without predicting it, right? So this idea of non-predictive control is embodied in 5 different principles. So the first one is the bird in hand principle, that you start with things already within your control. You don't have to have a brilliant idea. You don't have to have a gigantic market opportunity. All you need to do is to just ask yourself, who am I? What do I know? Whom do I know? And what kinds of ventures can I create? In the sense, what can I do for which somebody else will be willing to invest something or willing to work with me or willing to buy my product or service? So you have to create value for someone else. But you're just starting with things that you already know how to do, things that you already have within your control. Not only that, you do not invest, you do not say, I need $2 million to build this venture and now I go chase the $2 million. Instead, you're asking yourself, what can I afford to lose in trying to build this venture? Now, affordable loss does 2 different things for you. It keeps, in case failure happens, it keeps the downside risk low. Of course, if you're not going to invest anything more than you can afford to lose, you're not going to lose a lot, even if you fail, right? But it also does something really interesting on the upside, right? It asks you to think about, let's say your affordable loss is, I'm going to invest $20,000 and 6 months of Saturdays and Sundays because I don't want to leave my full-time job. Let's say that's your affordable loss. So on the upside, it asks you to think about, even if you lost 6 months of weekends and nights and weekends and $20,000 that you have saved up for this, would you still want to do this venture? So it makes you think about your choice of venture very differently as well. So from affordable loss, let's go on the left-hand side to the crazy quilt principle, because you start with who you are, what you know, whom you know. You come up with a couple of things you can do for affordable loss. And almost the first thing you do is you start talking to other people and bringing other people on board, kicking off the co-creation process. And depending on who comes on board, you will reshape the venture, you will reshape your own ideas and the opportunity. Along the way will be some surprises, and that's the lemonade principle. When life throws lemons at you, make lemonade, right? So when surprises come, whether they are positive or negative surprises, you learn how to make that an input into the process, and you continue to build the venture. And eventually, you get to the pilot and the plane principle, which is truly the logic that the future is not, something that comes out of some inevitable trends over time, or it is not something that is predictable ahead of time. The reason the future is not predictable is because what you and I choose to do makes a difference, that we can actually co-create the future, that history does not run on autopilot. Okay, so here is another way to think about it. Now you have these 5 principles. Now, how do you actually bring it into the classroom? What do you actually teach? So now that we have lots and lots of things that you can teach, as I said, people have created all kinds of materials. I just want to tell you the simplest thing you can teach, right? And you will see very quickly that this is, this is not even have to be about venture creation. It can be about life. Is something we call the ask. So a lot of entrepreneurship research and policy and education and everything has focused on the individual entrepreneur. Or sometimes people say, oh, you need a team. Teams are good. Teams are big. Here, what we are doing is to say, even if you start individually, you need to, even if you want to be this heroic individual entrepreneur, or even if you start with a team, you really are still going to have a whole bunch of people that you have to keep bringing on board as you grow the venture, and you have to manage them and you have to work with them. And the very first step on that is this idea of just going and asking people. How do you ask people in such a way that they self-select into your process? So we have a lot of data on this. I can even give you some notes that we have written on this. So this is just one example of what you can teach in the class. So what's an ask, right? Most of us in entrepreneurship know all about the pitch. The pitch is the causal idea, right? It says you decide what you want to do based on the opportunity, right? That you already have in mind some brilliant idea or a big market opportunity, and you decide what you want to do. Then you decide what resources you require. Then you say who has those resources, and then you go and pitch them, right? You figure out a way to convince them to give you the resources so you can build the venture. Well, as you can see, effectuation inverts this idea. It actually says, well, you just start with what you can do based on your means and affordable loss, and you ask anyone and everyone to help you co-create the future. And along the way, you craft a variety of ways of interacting with people so that different people with different visions of your idea can still come on board, and each of them invests only what they can afford to lose. And along the way, depending on who comes on board, you are open to reshaping your vision through those stakeholder commitments. Let me give you what this does, right? And even something as simple as the ask as a unit of effectuation. Now, when you look at this picture again of all the ventures in the economy, a lot of money gets spent either at the top left-hand corner trying to get people to start companies, sometimes to get people to start the right kind of companies, right? Stuff like that. And usually a lot of that is public money. But there's a lot of private money that gets spent at the other end, where chasing the big billion-dollar opportunity, if you will. But as I said, we want to think about the middle class of business. And at least one little thing that I have shown you so far from effectuation is this idea that you can teach people just by teaching people to ask. So most people are afraid to bring somebody else on board, and that limits their growth. Just teaching people, just to get them to ask, you can increase the growth potential of a lot of ventures. And by teaching people to ask effectually, right, using the ask as a unit through which you teach effectuation, you can push that frontier out even more. So here's a very quick glimpse of employment. This is data from the US, and you can see that curve in the actual data. And we calculated that even if 10% of 200K companies grow to 2 million, and 2% of 2 million companies, $2 million companies go to 20 million. So we're not talking about gigantic companies. That would solve the employment problem for good in the US. This is just a little example. You can do your own for different countries. All right. So now I think I still have a few minutes, so I will get to some of the other policy implications as well. I know I'm talking really fast. Being Indian helps here. We learn to talk very fast, actually. So in terms of collecting data on exit, the reason, so people always ask when I talk about effectuation, they ask this question like, what are the implications for performance? If you teach people to build a venture effectually, is there a probability of success going to go up? And the answer is not quite, right? What actually happens is that on the one hand, if success happens, the effectual process leads you to higher innovation. The probability of an innovative outcome increases. But if failure happens, the cost of failure remains low. As I mentioned, each stakeholder loses no more than he or she can afford to lose. So that's what we want to think about here. But there is a lot of confusion out there on the failure rate of entrepreneurship, and that comes in the way when we try to talk to people as to why we need to be teaching entrepreneurship. People have this idea that it's a highly risky enterprise, and so how do we go around and telling everybody about entrepreneurship? And so the conventional wisdom here is that most ventures fail. Interestingly enough, we need to ask ourselves, what does most mean and what does fail mean? So most people will tell you, most means 9 out of 10 will fail, and that data comes from venture capital. But even in the US, which has a robust venture capital community, less than 1% of ventures get any venture funding at all. And even if you look at the other end of companies that go public, 70% of them don't get any venture funding at all, venture capital funding. So given this data, I'm not sure how to use this number. There's another number out there. When you go and look at all the ventures, especially the employer firms out there, then it looks like 45% of those ventures are around 8 years or later. And about a third of those ventures that actually exit are profitable at the time of exit. When you look at all of these things, you start wondering, does it mean that the market doesn't exist or the money doesn't? And it turns out that about 2/3 to 3/4 of these exits, right, fail due to partner disagreements. And given all the stuff on the crazy principle in effectual entrepreneurship, you suddenly start realizing how important it is for us to teach entrepreneurs about partnering, about bringing people on board, about co-creating, more than all this stuff about risk-taking or not, and things like that. All right, so far so good. Justin or Daniel, how am I doing on time? I think I have another 5 minutes or so to go. So I'm going to continue until someone stops me here. So here we go. As I mentioned, partnerships are key. The crazy quilt principle is key. And the smallest unit on which we can begin teaching that is asking, the way to ask people to come on board, especially when you don't know who you are talking to and what they can actually bring to the table and what they might want, to ask in an open, effectual way, so they tell you, what would it take for them to come on board. As part of that, one of the ways that we can teach this, there's a lot of stuff that we're building for the classroom, experiential exercises, we have textbooks, all kinds of things, but we also think along with that, we want to think about people who have already done this before, and the role of entrepreneurs who have some entrepreneurial experience and who will actually mentor other entrepreneurs. So we have to create some kind of a mentor-based educational system as well, which is something that we are just beginning to think about. A couple of you had asked this question in the prior to the webinar on what kind of help can we provide people who already have a job, who are trying to start a venture. And one of the things we are doing in Bangalore is we have a peer mentoring system that we have developed, where once a week, entrepreneurs who are, or rather people who want to be entrepreneurs but who currently have a job, they actually come over the weekend, and the mentors assign them specific tasks that they carry out, and over 14 weeks, they learn a lot of the skills. So a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about in terms of the principles and the ask are not only something that we can teach inside a university curriculum or a classroom in a school. This is also something we can actually combine with the mentoring idea, and it makes mentoring a lot more efficient. So the organization is called IKEN, I-K-E-N, for those of you who want to look it up. We've had 2 cohorts of people already graduate, and we are learning how to develop this peer mentoring education scheme. But since I am a researcher, I also wanted to point out a couple of studies that are currently in the works, either about to be published or very close to publication. One of them I did with Christian Nielsen in Denmark, where they had all the data for 27 years on all entrepreneurs who started a first firm. Then we know what happened to the firm, whether it succeeded or failed, and then whether they started the second firm or not, and what happened to that firm. And we found something really interesting there. We found that a lot of people who had learned the lessons to succeed in the second venture, right, actually don't start after their first failure. And a lot of people who haven't really learned the lessons start. So there is this kind of a market for lemons happening there. This, again, I think so much of policies and incentives are given early on in the first startup, or trying to identify the gazelles. People are not looking at the person who's actually learning, right? Who started their first venture and something has happened. There is some kind of an educational policy intervention or something that we want to think into at the moment of exit. So people don't just come to the wrong conclusion of whether to try again or not. And also how to try. Remember, if you try for affordable loss, you can try again and again. So we have one study coming out that talks about that. We have another study where we did a conjoint analysis study of MBA students who were actually faced with this thing of taking a job versus starting a company. And this is a method from marketing. Anusha Ramesh is one of my doctoral students from Darden, with whom I've been working on this, and Stuart and Nick are my longtime colleagues and co-conspirators in developing a lot of the research. And in this one, we actually show that when you talk to MBA students who know a thing or two about business and entrepreneurs, entrepreneurship, they actually value the availability of an experienced entrepreneur as a mentor, equivalent to about $300,000 of funding. Right? So imagine you could either give them $300,000 in funding to go start a company, or you can provide them with an experienced mentor, and they actually prefer the mentor. So there's some provocative, interesting studies there, and things that we need to think about at the level of the economy and society on that. And then one of the things you want to think about is when you start building these relationships, you ask somebody and somebody wants to come on board. There's a lot of issues connected with equity relationships that we're not teaching to entrepreneurs at this point in time. We don't have all that much good data on it. And I know there was a question yesterday about equity versus loan, and it's a fascinating topic how entrepreneurs around the world, sometimes even in many parts of the US, do not really consider equity relationships. They think that you have to hold everything close to your heart. And they think that debt is always better than equity. In actual fact, it is not. Think about the structure of debt versus the structure of equity. When you have debt, what happens? When you make a lot of money, of course, you need to share only a small bit. So that part of it is good. But if you don't do well, you still owe the money. Whereas in an equity relationship, sure, if you make a lot of money, you're sharing a lot of the money. But if you don't make the money, you don't owe anything. So this is something that we need to understand in a much more practical, down-to-earth, in the trenches level that we are not understanding yet. But we've been beginning to look at that, and we'll be developing some insights into that. Okay, so I'm almost done. And this is the last one, probably the most profound one that we need to do that. We need to think differently about employment. Again, let's start with conventional wisdom on this, right? People think that it's always a choice to take up a wage employment or to become an entrepreneur, or I have to leave a job and start a company. But we live in the age of outsourcing. We live in the age of Upwork, right? We live in an age where people have to mix and match. It is no longer that you have a job versus you have entrepreneurship. And yet, our education is geared to this strange ideal of steady, lifelong employment, when that thing actually doesn't exist in most companies. Think about multinational corporations, sometimes you can get good benefits, but then they also downsize, right? There is no 100% job security, except perhaps in the public sector. And I'm not very sure how sustainable that is or how useful that is in a developing country. At the same time, not only are we educating people with this dream of lifelong, steady, secure employment, but we also have healthcare and social welfare, all kinds of, retirement and everything connected with that kind of employment. This just gives me kind of butterflies in the stomach when you think about that. The flip side of it is that entrepreneurship is worshipped these days, right? On the one hand, everybody thinks it's a high risk thing and I don't want to do it, but you really admire people who do it, But if you actually go look at the data now, sober up a little bit, a third of entrepreneurs, right, start their ventures while they still have a full-time job. And billions of people around the world do not even have the choice of a job. Entrepreneurship is the only game in town, right? They may not call it entrepreneurship. They're just thinking about making a living. Whatever it is, you grow 2 tomato plants in the back of your house, and you use one plant, the output from one plant for feeding your family, and the other one you try to sell. It can be so. When you think about entrepreneurship, I think we need to really look at the whole landscape a little bit more carefully, a little bit more soberly. But most importantly, we need to look at demographics. We need to look at the fact that 2/3 of the entire workforce is going to come from India and China in the next 20 years or so. If we are to give skills and really create full-time, secure, steady employment, I have no idea how we are going to do this, right? So I want us to spend a lot of time thinking this through very differently. We want to think about, we cannot say 12 to 16 years of education, and then you're going to get a job, and then you're going to save up enough money, and then you're going to start a company. The thing just doesn't make any sense. So I think we have to think about how do we combine work, learning. By learning, I mean not necessarily degree learning, but skills development, entrepreneurship, and education. How can we bring all of that together over 12, not just 12 to 16 years, but lifelong, right? So I'd like us to think about some innovative ideas on how to do that. We also should be teaching everybody in the population, not just teaching about entrepreneurship, but making it clear to them that there are ways in which you can participate in entrepreneurship, even if you don't start your own venture. For example, you can go find a couple of ventures that are exciting and become part of that. So you can find a little, sweet shop that you think makes the best sweets on earth, but there's only one shop, and they don't have any presence on the web, and there's no way of scaling up. And maybe you are an IT person and you have a steady job, and you can spend Saturdays and Sundays, you can go to that company and say, let me build a website for you. Let's think about how we can grow. And you can make sort of an equity deal where you're not interfering in their business, but you can actually say that whatever extra sales you bring in, maybe you take a small share of that. And eventually, maybe you build enough trust and partner with them, and that you actually grow the venture so that it franchises around the world, that kind of thing. So I think there are ways, especially educated people can go and participate in entrepreneurship, and you can yourself become, even if you haven't actually started a venture, because you have certain skills that you can bring to scaling up ventures, you can actually participate in entrepreneurship in a variety of different ways. And I'd like to think about a whole bunch of them and teach people about that. So the idea really is when we educate anybody for anything, not only should we make entrepreneurship as a part of the education, but we really need to get people to think about their careers differently. They have to know not only to find a job, but to sometimes, as I said, go and pitch a non-existent job to an existing venture, right? Because you can do something for that venture, And that little small business or little growing business is not really able to think about all those things, and yet they are starved for talent all the time. So the idea is to find a non-existent job, right? Just don't look for jobs that are out there. Then you start thinking about, can you actually design and create your own job? It's not just self-employment, but really thinking about all the things that you can do that you love to do, and how do you make it pay on your own? And then you start thinking about starting a venture and co-creating jobs for others. And hopefully, you will change the face of education and employment and entrepreneurship. And maybe even some of these words will go away if you do this right. And when I say you, I don't care whether you are an individual, you're an educator, you're a policymaker. I think the you just covers everybody on earth. Okay, I have talked really fast, and I think I didn't go over time too much. So I'm going to hand it over for Q&A at this point in time.
Thanks very much.
All right. Is somebody curating the questions?
Yes, I'll pitch the questions to you. I think drawing off your last point, we did have a question from Barbara as to whether you are aware of formal public and private sort of partnerships that are focused on changing the entrepreneurship mindset. You've spoken really about sort of mass entrepreneurship education, and that obviously needs to, that involves schools. Are there particularly effective approaches, in addition to the ones that you've mentioned, that you've seen? That would be question one. And a related one is does the approach to entrepreneurship, is it culturally different in different countries? You operate obviously here in America, you operate in India, you operate in China. In the approach to entrepreneurship education, both pre-entrepreneurship and dealing with entrepreneurs themselves, are those countries different in the way you need to approach them? Or are these some fairly fundamental kind of human-based competencies, and you can take the same approach?
Those are actually two different questions. The first one, do I know off the top of my head some kind of a public-private partnership that works great? Not entirely, although I think Endeavor is a very good template. There's Endeavor in several developing countries like Endeavor Turkey, Endeavor Indonesia, Endeavor Brazil. So that is something definitely to be looked at. I also know that in India there is a National Skills Development Corporation that's trying to do a lot of different things, but at this point it's more like a hodgepodge, like everybody's giving every idea. And I think sometimes maybe that's what we really need. We need like all kinds of people pitching in all kinds of ways, because the problem is so huge. So that's kind of the answer to the first one. The second one is, of course, there are differences country by country, because in many countries, just to start with, regulations are different, right? The welfare state in Europe, or Northern Europe, for example, is very different from the US, and it's very different from India, where we don't have as many safety nets or as many incentives as you might find, say, in Denmark or Sweden. So there are country differences in regulations. There are also country differences in just cultural aspects in terms of attitude towards failure. That's kind of interesting. There's cultural attitudes in terms of how you interact with others, especially the point I'm making about relationships, about equity relationships, about partnerships, about co-creating the future. There are differences. But at the heart of it all, because we know when we go, this is true on the ground. But when you actually go and look at people who have built very enduring, value-creating ventures around the world, both in for-profit and in other forms like Grameen Bank or Lijjat Papad in India, or any one of those things, you find that these same principles of effectuation and the techniques of relationships between people, where you share ownership, and sharing ownership doesn't mean just shares in the stock market kind of shares. There are other ways you want to think about how do you structure the relationship so that if both of us do well, both of us benefit, but if the venture doesn't do well, neither of us loses too much, right? So that particular thing is the same. So the lessons learned from entrepreneurship, irrespective of where you did the entrepreneurship and who you were to begin with, those remain the same. Although the starting point in each place may be very different. I hope it's not a very simple answer, but I hope it's a clear answer to the question.
Thank you. And I guess there's a related one from Anne Chloe, which is she makes the point that entrepreneurs have specific skills. They're creative, they're innovative, they're proactive. Presumably there are some school systems around the world that are better at teaching or better in imbuing those sorts of characteristics in people than others. You know, we hear about the excellent performance out of some East Asian schools in terms of science and maths, but there's also criticism that they're far less creative in terms of how students come out of those systems. So, are there, at a student level, I mean, are there good approaches for teaching those sorts of, I don't know if you call them skills or their attributes? How would you describe them? And then what are some good school-based approaches, or some countries that seem to do this better than others from your perspective?
So I'll start with a kind of an overgeneralization, which is, the best school is the school of hard knocks. I think that still remains true to some extent. But so on a more positive note, though, it's because the whole idea of entrepreneurship education is so new, right? It took 200 years to develop a science curriculum that actually works well in the K through 12 system around the world. And even then, we only have like 15% literacy for the most part, right? I may be wrong on the number, but it's not, it's not 50% and more. And so when we think about how much time it takes, so we are in the very early stages of developing curricula and practices and programs that actually work very well. But there are, this is being attacked on multiple fronts in multiple ways. And there are people who have developed very interesting ways, whether you talk about, Y Combinator in Silicon Valley, or you talk about the national NFTE, NIFTY, that actually goes and teaches in K through 12 systems in some of the most difficult neighborhoods in the US, or the Ashoka model for social entrepreneurship. There are many different ways that people are beginning to teach, they're experimenting. They're also looking at what works and what doesn't work. There's research looking at that as well. So I think there are lots of good models out there, but there's no one model that I would say this is like the best model. And I'm actually saying I want to invite everybody to engage in developing that and thinking about what would count as good and how can we show it is good. So I think this is really early stages, but there are some wonderful efforts out there, and we need to, one of the things we can do as policymakers is start kind of just creating an archive of what is actually going on and what's working and what's not. There's no one place that you can go to where you can find this information. So that itself would be an interesting thing for us to explore.
Thank you. So we've been talking about schools and school-aged people, but much of your presentation was talking also about existing entrepreneurs. Now we've got a question, which is why don't we just focus on the Gazelles? And just for people's information, obviously Gazelles that's a particular term that I think is an OECD expression and means a young company that grows 20% year on year for 3 years. But they make the point that Gazelles, although they're small in number, they create most of the jobs. So we should just focus on them. You've spoken, however, about a middle class of companies. So if you can perhaps revisit what you said about that middle class of companies and why focusing on them, that broader range rather than just the Gazelles, is important. And maybe a related question, the sorts of people, these sorts of entrepreneurs are, I suspect you'd agree, incredibly busy. Running a startup business or even an established small business is you're juggling lots of balls. How easy is it to engage those sorts of people in formal education, especially those who may not come from a technical background and might be a bit intimidated or suspicious of education? So how do you grab those people and get them into learning mode in the first place?
Justin, you're really good at asking, putting together two big questions in one. Okay. So the first one about the Gazelles, right? I just laugh about the Gazelles. I mean, when you look at the definition of a gazelle, whether you define it in terms of 20% year-on-year growth, or whether you define it as people who have already employees between 20 and 500 or something like that, and focus on them. What does focus on them mean? Usually in policy or in financial investment, it just becomes the idea of you want to predict who is going to do it, or you're going to look for some idiotic characteristics like, these people have, we did some empirical study over 5 years last year, and then these people had certain, they were 41 and they had $20,000 in the bank or whatever, and you think that that is therefore going to create a gazelle. What you really want to look at is what, is it actually easy to predict which one of those startups are actually going to become gazelles? And I suspect that it is very, very, very difficult, if not impossible, to predict those. And we are definitely not going to be predicting the ones who are actually going to live for a long time and do the kinds of things that a robust economy requires. So it's like saying, let's teach science not only to future scientists, let's just teach it to those few people who are most likely to actually invent the best technology. And all I will say is good luck with that. I would rather, and I also have this bias that in general, when we have policy or big money trying to change the world in some way by focusing on some people, like selecting some people for benefits and not other people, we usually end up creating really perverse incentives. So I feel very strongly that it's not a question of targeting this or that, but if we actually develop the soil, right, which is what public goods, people who manage public goods do very well, is to create the infrastructure, to create the soil within which all kinds of unexpected people can thrive. And great enterprises require not just entrepreneurs, they require all these other stakeholders. And how are you going to do? People always ask me, like, we want to build another Silicon Valley. Well, the thing with Silicon Valley is soil, right? You go to a hairdresser, they know how to enable a deal to happen, not because somebody taught them in formal school. It just happens all the time. So the thing with Gazelles is, I'm actually saying don't focus on any one thing. Like, let's prepare the soil, teach people to pitch in multiple different ways, so we don't have this idea of employment versus entrepreneurship, that kind of thing. Now, let me tackle the second question, which is, I'm suggesting we need to look at mentoring is very, very important. And how do you get entrepreneurs who are very busy involved in formal education? And I'm saying drop the formal part, right? Again, we want to think of education as a basket. There will be some people who care about, entrepreneurship and about education so much that they will actually give money and time and spend time, do stuff with you. There are people who totally believe, experienced entrepreneurs who really believe education is the way to go. And there are experienced entrepreneurs who think education is a complete waste of time. So the idea is to say, we need to develop multiple corridors. So in Bangalore, when we started ICANN, one of the reasons we did that was there were a lot of successful, experienced entrepreneurs who really cared about entrepreneurship in Bangalore. And they said, we want to help people. But they got very tired of individually mentoring, one or two or four or five entrepreneurs all the time, especially entrepreneurs who came with all these wrong ideas. They would leave their IT job and start this, and they'd make the same things over and over again. So the entrepreneurs came to me and said, we need to have some kind of an ongoing way of doing this, where the requirement from any individual experienced entrepreneurs is affordable loss for them. And for the wannabe entrepreneurs, also it's affordable loss for them. And that's why we came up with this model of 1 hour every weekend. And there are multiple touch points with multiple entrepreneurs. So no one experienced entrepreneur has to spend time thinking about individual ventures. And we are also teaching people to do some peer learning. So that's a different model than either formal education or formal mentorship that Endeavor does so well. I think we need multiple models, and we really need to stop picking winners and losers, which nobody can do. Neither the private sector nor the public sector is any good at doing that. I truly believe entrepreneurship is like science, and we need to learn, take our cues from the way we develop science education and the way we do science policy over time. And I think we need to apply whatever insights are there from history to developing entrepreneurship education, because I think this is too big a deal for us to be thinking purely in terms of venture success.
Thank you. I'd endorse your comments about Gazelles. I'd have to say the policy experience is that if a company's grown in the past, it probably won't grow in the future, and if it does, it's extremely difficult to predict. So although the idea of being a sniper as a policymaker sounds appealing, and just picking out those few companies, in practice, it is virtually impossible. If it was easier, then venture capitalists would make money. In fact, most of them don't. So perhaps the last question, and you touched on a really interesting example from Bangalore, which is about how do you, in essence, de-risk the potential for for potential entrepreneurs to move into entrepreneurship when they are sitting in perhaps a corporate job, or maybe in a lot of our countries it's sitting in a government-owned business. So do you have other examples of how you can I guess de-risk and induce people who have developed business skills, who probably have networks, and so are much more likely maybe to give entrepreneurship or to be successful entrepreneurship, to induce them, to encourage them to cross the river into the world of startups and running their own business?
Are you asking me for examples, or are you asking me for ideas on how we could do that?
Oh, well, both. Of course. Asking to
as far as examples are concerned, there aren't too many good examples, unfortunately, right? So that's one of the reasons we kind of tried to invent one in Bangalore, because there is no very good way. I mean, almost everything that exists is extraordinarily selective. For example, there are technical incubators around the world that work with scientists in universities or in R&D departments, scientists who have invented science. And what do? They do the same thing. They ask you to apply, write a business plan, and you have to pitch, and then they pick a few winners who will go into these incubators. And and I think I'm very much with the guys at Y Combinator and with Peter Thiel and a whole bunch of people who say, this kind of selection procedure is not the way to do it. So I kind of know what we shouldn't be doing, and which is picking winners and losers. But given that, now you think about, there are many, many different ways we could actually enable people who currently have a job or who have a job that has been downsized. So I think, for example, working with corporations as part of their exit package for their employees at the time of downsizing. So they give like services like resume, right? They get you to, they teach you how to rewrite your resume, and they give you some kind of a brush up on interview skills, things like that. Now at that point in time, we should be able to do, I don't know, a 3-week, a 3-month package where you can actually give them the option, not just of starting their own venture, but also taking their skills and going to an entrepreneur in their area, whether you define area as industry or as geography, and actually figure out a way. So I think that thing doesn't exist at all. And I don't see why we are not thinking about developing something like that. I think a series of corporate partnerships with some experimental programs, and then we look at how to work it out and then scale that up would be a great project for policymakers to take up, I think. So I have ideas on how to do it. I don't have great examples because they don't exist as far as I know, but I don't know everything, of course. In fact, I would invite people, if they have these examples, do share them with me. I would love to see a place to go where we get some of this information on entrepreneurship education and programs that actually do something unusual and also effectively. So I'm afraid I don't have a clear example in mind, but I have an idea of what we could create, and I can even imagine how to create it.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. We haven't addressed a number of questions that we've received. What we'll try and do is touch on them on the IPP. I'm just looking at a couple of them. For instance, we have a question around whether there are business games that can be used by policymakers And Saras, you might know about some that you can suggest. A question about the Indian startup scene in the Indian innovation system, a bit specific for this webinar, but we'll post a couple of reports that I'm aware of that have been done in the last 12 months on that startup scene. There is a question about what local governments can do around entrepreneurship, and I'll refer you to a previous presentation from my colleague Victor Mulas, which very much looks at local entrepreneurship, and in particular what New York has done to promote entrepreneurship. But we will try and address all those questions. Thank you very much for participating, Saras. Very much, it's been really enjoyable and engaging, and you have given me some ideas that I'm going to take away, and I might talk to you offline about how to broaden them out. Thank you to everyone who's joined us. If you wouldn't mind filling out the quick survey at the end, that'd be great. So from Washington, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening.